Thank you for your trust. And I mean that sincerely. I am humbled that people would think I would have something to say that again might matter or would be worth your while. We have a live audience right here. I still don't really know how to work before a camera, so if I'm not always looking at you, please don't take offense. But we want to make it as personal as possible, even though the theme might seem a bit abstract. I hope we can make it real and practical and life-changing even, because that's what the word means. You know, the word transformation, which as Michael mentioned, maybe is being overdone today. I could only find it, I'm sure it's in other places, but I could only find it once in the New Testament, Romans 12, where Paul says, don't be conformed. So he puts it in contradiction to the way everybody else operates. Don't be conformed to the world around you, but be transformed. And then he describes ever so slightly what he might mean by that. And he says, be transformed by the renewal of your mind. And I think he's spot on. I mean, that's what we're talking about. The Greek word is a word you probably also know in its English form, metamorphosis. That's the Greek word. So what does it mean literally in Greek? To change forms, to change forms. So what we're going to try to do is describe as best I can what that might mean. This conversation started a while back. People are always asking me why I say the things I say, and I say, I don't know. How do I get the assurance to say the things I say? And I'm not sure of that either. But someone said, could you sum up in 3 categories what all the too much stuff you've tried to talk about, what do they fit under? And so I thought about it, and I said, well, the first, as I look at much of my life, I've been trying to facilitate conversion, change of mind, change of consciousness. And I see that probably in the books even as early as the Enneagram, the books like 12-Step Spirituality, the Men's Initiation Rites, all the work on contemplation, of course, which is really trying to change how you see. It's not telling you what to see, it's teaching you how to see. And I've said that probably too many times, but I think it might be, if I can dare to put it this way, the Achilles heel of so much organized religion. That we tend to tell people what to see, we don't teach them how to see. And to see the right thing in the wrong way is not to see. It's that simple. Then the second area, I said, well, what's the sign? What are the indicators that someone is authentically transformed? And I talk about that in, I think, my book's Falling Upward, the more recent book on Franciscanism, Eager to Love, and the book Dancing Standing Still, where in all books on those 3 in different ways, I talk about the movement downward, the movement out of power toward powerlessness. And I'm going to try to describe that, but that might be too direct a description for some people. But I am increasingly convinced it's true. If I don't see that in a person, if they're using religion itself as another way to be powerful, important, climbing in whatever form, I don't think they've experienced authentic conversion. Because once you've experienced fullness, and we'll try to describe it, you don't need to keep filling up yourself. You don't take yourself so seriously, because more than anything else, a conversion experience is an experience of the absolute. And once you've experienced the absolute, everything else is relativized, including yourself. And when you don't see that recognition happening in someone's life, you have good reason to question whether it's been an authentic transformation. But we'll describe that in a bit. Then thirdly, I think what we've tried to do is give people practices a way of maintaining over the long haul what they've experienced in the maybe short period of so-called conversion. It doesn't do much good if your momentary state doesn't become a permanent stage. And that's, of course, the work of contemplation itself, mostly in the books Naked Now, which I'm going to be quoting from a bit, in the book Everything Belongs, and in the later book Immortal Diamond. What is this contemplative mind that allows you to maintain the fruits of conversion over the long haul? Because unless you do that, the fact that you had an emotional experience with Jesus 15 years ago really doesn't make much difference. It's not going to change you. It's not going to change the world. It'll make you think you're enlightened, and you might or might not be. So, let's start with trying to describe what do I mean when I say a transformation of mind or consciousness. In other words, it's not telling you believe this, believe that. It's not telling you to join this group or join that group. And we Catholics use that term still. A convert is someone who joins the Catholic Church. Well, I hope so. I hope they've experienced transformation of consciousness, but there's a lot of evidence that that's not true. We thought pretty much we created our little checklist, and I'm not being cynical when I say that, but it was that. Baptism, First Communion, First Confession, Confirmation. It was even better if you were married in the church. But you could do that whole checklist, let's just be honest, and not be converted, right? Not be transformed. So it's the transformed mind is telling you how to process what's coming at you. It's not what comes at you, it's what you do with it. So if your mind is still argumentative, if it's still oppositional or antagonistic, if it's still either or thinking, I can give you the doctrine of transubstantiation if you're a Catholic, or biblical inerrancy if you're a Protestant, and you'll make garbage out of it. You don't know how to do it. You'll make it something to prove that you're right and you're higher than other people. So you can't be looking at things in a utilitarian way, a functional way. In other words, what's in it for me? How will this make me look? Will this give me some brownie points with God? Those are all self-referential ways. I'm going to try to describe in a most simple phrase. I don't think I've used it before exactly this way, but the contemplative set of eyes, the contemplative way of looking at something is letting it be what it is. Letting it be what it is until it shows itself in itself and as itself without me meddling. Meddling in it by needing to describe it, needing to understand it, needing to explain it. As soon as you start meddling by writing your commentary on anything, and if you watch, sisters and brothers, most of what we call thinking is meddling. All right, it's just you play around with an idea, so it fits in your frame of reference. Huh? You play around with an idea, so it is to your liking. This just won't get you anywhere, you know, because who remains in charge? You, always you. Let me quote, if you don't mind. This must be terribly narcissistic to quote from your own books, but I'm really not quoting myself. It's other people I'm talking about. What I see in this quote from Romans 12:2 is Paul saying that what you need is a whole new head. You need a new motherboard, to use our contemporary way of thinking, changing the actual hardware that processes your experiences. Not just having a new experience, but changing the hardware or software, I don't know what the right metaphor is, that processes your experience. And what we know is that the one universal addiction that we all have without knowing you personally is all human beings are addicted to their way of thinking. That's it. You are, I am. And until you recognize that you tend to process most things in the same way. An antagonistic way, grab around it and prove that it's right way, a way that's sort of angry or filled with negativity or maybe filled with immediate infatuation. You're an enthusiast. But that isn't really changing consciousness. That's using your old consciousness. So transformation is not merely a change of morals. It might lead to that. A change of group affiliation. It might lead to that. A change of your belief system. It might lead to that. But a change at the very heart of the way that you receive, hear, and pass on your own experience. Now that doesn't happen in a moment. To change basically how you see, how you take in the moment and what you do with the moment. Do you use the moment always to aggrandize yourself? Or do you use the moment to enter into compassion? Those are two different ways of seeing. And until that changes, nothing really changes. What I'm saying, and I don't want to offend anybody, but I'd much sooner work with a truly transformed Hindu or Buddhist or Jew or Muslim than I would an untransformed Catholic. Any day. Any day. Please don't be offended if you're Catholic, but I've spent much of my life working with untransformed Catholics, who have all the right belief, who supposedly belong to the right group, but their way of processing the moment is pretty small. It's not going to help the world. It's not even going to help them. It doesn't create community. It doesn't create life. See, if it's true, I believe it has to be life-giving, or it isn't true. If it deals death and offers death to the neighbor, then how can that be God's truth? In this same book, The Naked Now, my 11th chapter is devoted to a Jesuit. See how broad-minded I am. And not just a Jesuit, but a Canadian Jesuit. And his name is Bernard Lonergan. He's not so well known anymore. He died in 1984. And his books are probably only read by theologians. So Lonergan, who was also a scientist, along with being a philosopher and a theologian, he observed that after the scientific mind gained prominence in the West, it became difficult not to think of God as merely the result of pie-in-the-sky conditioning, because clearly this God could no longer be verified by the scientific method. In the face of this huge switch that we've been suffering from for 3 centuries now, to the rational scientific mind, he suggested that what religion needed was a new foundation for knowledge. That's sort of what I was trying to say. Because the old foundations just don't work anymore. And we see this on a grand scale today. Most people, not all, most people who are members of organized religion did have early conditioning in that direction. But what I'm talking about, more often than not here, is people who maybe it wasn't early conditioning, but they did have a conversion experience. They did have a transformational experience whereby the great horizon opened up. And so that was the group he was trying to invite and trying to talk to. He was fascinated by the scientific mind and the scientific method, and he rightly felt it had much to offer religion too. But he felt that religion had much to offer science, especially in regard to method and the cleansing of the eyes of the seer. He quoted William Blake, as I often have too, the English poet. He says, all we need to do is cleanse the doors of perception, and we shall see things as they are. And how are they? As they are, infinite, always infinite. But it takes a special pair of eyes to see things that way. Going back to Lonergan, while never denying the objectivity of truth, Lonergan claimed that most religious people have an exaggerated view of the objectivity of truth, and especially their capacity to understand it. So you might well say there is objective truth. I would say that. I believe that. But does that mean little old Richard can understand and communicate objective eternal truth? Not very well. As you see right now, I'm struggling for words. It's sort of, for me, a humorous paradox that in a faith which speaks about the journey, the faith journey of following Jesus, Christians claim to have total and absolute truth from the very beginning. You do see that cancels out any notion of faith. We're not talking about a journey of faith at all. We're talking about a rational lust for certitude. And the irony is, this is really the irony, that so many people in the realm of science, and maybe you are one of them or you've worked with them, are quite willing to work with theories and hypotheses. Isn't that interesting? We've changed places. We clergy are certain about everything, and scientists work with theories, which means, what Gandhi maybe called experiments with truth. I'll take that kind of honest seeker who's open to what reality presents to him or her. And all you got to do is give them the right pair of glasses and then trust that God will always present the God self in a way that person can understand. So, back to the text here. Lonergan taught that the only real way to find objectivity today was to help people clarify and heal their subjectivity. Now, I hate to tell you, Christians, but that's what Buddhists have been saying for hundreds of years. The only way you get to objectivity is to clarify and heal your subjectivity, how you see. But Lonergan gave a very old-fashioned Christian word for that process. He used the old word. He said, this is what we mean by conversion. He believed, and he tried to demonstrate, that the process of conversion was itself the great clarifier. It was the healing of our woundedness, our neediness, our natural egocentricity, our separateness and our superiority. And until all of those are healed, you and I will not see truthfully. Isn't that sort of obvious? You see everything through your own wound, through your own agenda, through your own anger. So we've presented the Western world with a huge and brilliant metaphysics, which I could go to great lengths to try to convince you of. I've been convinced of it myself, but we see that most of our people aren't that convinced because there's a lot of passivity in Christianity. I think that's probably not an overstatement. Just sort of along for the ride. That's what happens when you only half believe, when you only half experience, when you only half know. And it isn't that we didn't tell our people good things, but we didn't give them the right head by which to receive and understand those things. So Lonergan believed that authentically converted people in this way, who'd been healed of their own subjectivity, their own biases, anger, agenda, and egocentricity, he assumed, would see the truth. I don't think that's a difficult assumption. It sort of makes sense, at least to me. And he said, as far as humans are able and would see it in a way that could be shared, at least with other converted people. But people who aren't on that same level of consciousness, they'll call you nuts. Of course they will. And that's why many times you just have to learn to be quiet. Because it can't be understood unless along with people who've made the same journey. Now that doesn't make you better, doesn't make you more superior. In fact, Knowing that you don't know, which is true knowing, in fact, always makes you humble around your knowing. You know that you half know. That's what Paul says in Corinthians. All knowledge is imperfect, and we see through a glass darkly. So Lonergan moved us from searching for and arguing about airy abstractions to changing the seer himself, to changing the seer herself. This was his new foundation for truth. And it takes some huge books to prove this. I'm very oversimplifying it, and sort of Franciscan way of saying it. It doesn't sound very smart, but when he says it, it sounds real smart, real, real convincing. He says, no, I say this, I guess. He says, Jesus sent his apostles to fish for people. And we have spent much of our history instead fishing for ideas, clarifying and defining concepts, organizational charts, fishing more for right ideas than for transformed people. So Lonergan boldly ends his great books on insight, saying that conversion, and this almost seems too simple, too naive. He said, what it all comes down to is conversion is the experience by which one becomes an authentic human being. It's not primarily conversion to a religion, it's conversion to seeing truthfully. And the only way you can see truthfully, sorry for the bad news, is you got to get yourself out of the way. And that's the price that's too high for most people. I want to have the truth and not get myself out of the way. Well, what he says, and I 100% agree with him, you don't have much truth. It's all about you. It's all about your culture. It's all about your unique, I hope, wonderful form of education. It's all about your temperament. It's all about your Enneagram number, It's and those are all fine filters, but they just don't get you that far, Now, once we can honor that hearing in each one of us, say, okay, I accept that you're seeing through a glass darkly, and I'm seeing through a glass darkly too. What does that teach us? Compassion and humility around words. In fact, I began that chapter with an epigraph from a French philosopher, Georges Bataille. He says, mere words have something of quicksand about them. Only experience is the rope that is thrown to us in the quicksand. Then you know something that you can't know in any other way. Well, I think the well-trained spiritual mind, what we call the contemplative mind, is open to all of the experience, not just to that which fits the rational mind, but it knows with the head and the heart and the body and the soul. Now, to keep all of those listening stations open, that's the work of spirituality. And that, in the end, is a much more holistic knowing, which is why Lonergan says, conversion is simply what makes you an authentic human being, which then is open to the divine, open to transcendence, open to the whole picture. So let's start with that I think this whole thing called church, sacraments, priesthood, Bible, all of it depends on the premise of conversion. All of it. If the person celebrating that sacrament or the priest preaching the sermon is not an authentically converted person, all right, you and I know at this point in history, it doesn't work. We're just going along for the ride. And it doesn't mean we got to hate that person or reject that sacrament. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that conversion, transformation, change of form, which was such a radical movement that John's gospel even calls it, being born again. Wow. Born again. Now, even that word has been so cheapened that it again means an emotional Jesus experience. But there is no religious language in the word born again. Huh? It absolutely means like a fresh start, a new pair of glasses, a new set of eyes, a new way of seeing reality. So authentic conversion depends upon some kind of experience of the absolute, which leads to a radical change of consciousness. As I put it before, it relativizes everything else. Now, that experience of the absolute, it might first, as Rudolf Otto said, might be based in fear, that there's something much bigger than me. There's something more transcendent. It's an awesome experience. And so a lot of people, I'm sorry to say, but maybe it's true of us, we start our spiritual journey not in love with this absolute, but afraid of it. And we try to create little techniques and formulas to control this absolute power. That's the beginning of almost all religion. It's all about techniques to control this maybe ambivalent God. So he's on my side or she's on my side and I'm in control. That's low-level religion. It might have begun by a moment of authentic absolute, but much of the journey is letting that experience of the absolute become love. And that's the whole journey, That's what you will fight all the middle of your life, testing it. Is it true? Are you love? Are you on my side? Are you good? Are you for me more than I'm for myself? Are you with me? Are you in me? I'm writing a book on the Trinity right now, so I'm filled with this kind of language that the Trinitarian belief just allows God to come at you from every angle. And all of your levels of experience can be captured and can be spoken to. But let me leave that for now and go to the third. I said in a lot of my work, what are the signs that your experience of the absolute, your experience of transformation is authentic? And here's the best way I can summarize it. I'll try to explain it. There's a never-failing movement toward the edge, the outside, the lower, the suffering, and the simple. If I don't see one of those movements, it'll take different forms in all of your lives. Don't let me describe it in a narrow way. But if your God experience doesn't lead you toward, I'm going to repeat it, the edge, the outside, the lower, the suffering, the simple. If yours is all about climbing and using God so you can climb higher and be holier than thou, and we see this even in the CAC. We present ourselves as a education center that's trying to teach transformation. But I think I could check with the staff. I mean, even a lot of people who come to our conferences and even a lot of people who call online to attend this conference, I'm sure it's not you, are sometimes quite nasty. I'm just going to say it. You can tell that religion itself has become another way to be a consumer. You understand? I want to attend this. I want to go to that. Of course, we trained them for that. We told you attending Mass was the end-all and the be-all. So attendance at things became in people's mind a sign that you were holy. So now we just transfer this to conferences and webcasts and books and, anything that we become, as many of the Buddhists say, spiritual consumers. And even God and enlightenment is another consumer product. I hate to say this, but at some of our recent conferences, when our staff was waiting there to open up the door to let people come in, they charged in like it was the sale day at Target, to get the front seat so I can really hear Richard just right here, Brothers and sisters, I've got to make it that practical. if we're still doing the same old thing with the same old mind that wants the front seat, that feels I can attend or get in on a conference in a nasty way, it ain't going to help. It ain't going to work. You're doing the right thing with the wrong motivation. That's my whole point. It's not what you do, it's why you do what you do, and it's how you do what you do. And it's the energy with which you do what you do. That's what reveals authentic transformation. Forgive me for making it so real. I'm sure it doesn't apply to you. It's those other strange people who sometimes come into our world. But I got to be honest, it's always disappointing that so many religious people can be so immature. And this is as true of people on the left as it is people on the right. So don't make conservative and liberal the correct naming of transformation. There are kind, compassionate, humble, contemplative people on the conservative side, and there are kind, humble, patient, transformed people on the progressive side. So let's just get over that. That's not the issue. And in fact, you can waste 30 years of your life. A lot of my generation did. Not trying to allow themselves to be changed, but to prove they were true conservatives or true liberals. Who cares? Who cares? It's a false naming of the nature of transformation. So if I don't see some kind of realignment of your economics and your politics, I'm going to make it that real. Now, I'm not talking about our dualistic split between Democrats and Republicans. Don't even go there. I mean, that makes Americans think they're really enlightened because they can choose between these two. It's totally invested in dualistic thinking, understand? Because if we'd really be honest, the person isn't even there in that field. You have to move. You will be led beyond such dualistic choosing between two. But I am saying that the very way you look at a political issue doesn't fit into the usual culture wars that we have today. The very way that you examine our economy. It isn't communist, it isn't socialist, it isn't capitalist. You have nowhere to lay your head. It isn't easy being a transformed person. It really isn't. Because you'd critique all of those. Now, who's going to like you now? If you critique communism and socialism and capitalism, you don't fit in any group, do you? That's what it means to have a changed form. You're, as Paul says in Philippians, your citizenship is in heaven now. Because no citizenship in this world is going to like you 100%. So normally you will be concerned about issues of justice, issues of people who are excluded. You will want to do some kind of service that is not just paying bills. And you know, brothers and sisters, that is the way you can tell what your vocation is. What would you do? What do you do, even if and when you're not getting paid for it? When there's no paycheck, how do you fill up your time? That's what you're really passionate about. That's your real vocation. Now, that's what we have in religious life called the vow of poverty, that we had to get that whole money thing out of the way. So we do our ministry, we do our work, even if and when, and maybe most especially, when we weren't getting a penny for it. Now, you see, that's why I say it changes your economics. And maybe we don't want that to happen. Maybe we are quite comfortable in the world of consuming and producing. But all of that is called into question. So some kind of seeing the light, seeing the love, seeing the truth, seeing the presence in other people instead of people who are just like us, right? If there isn't evidence of that in your life, there is no reason I would believe you're a converted person. I'm sorry. If you spend the rest of your life making sure you're with white middle-class American people, who belong to your denomination, I don't believe you're converted. I mean, maybe a little first stage tribal conversion, but that's not what the world needs now. Huh? We need transformed people. And if we're going to call Jesus the Savior of the world, not just the Savior of Western white people, then we got a lot of work to do. Huh? So nothing else, it seems to me, gives clear evidence of a change of consciousness and of the displacement of my ego and my false self. Just using a new Christ vocabulary, just using a new church vocabulary doesn't impress me anymore, because it comes too easily. It can make you think you're someplace where you really are not. You know, when I was growing up Catholic, and I'm happy I did, it was a wonderful way to start life. But we were told we were the one true religion. And then I found out later almost everybody's told that, but we really believed it. Of course, we were able to sustain it for a long time because we tended to live in Catholic ghettos. I went to Catholic grade school, high school, college, and postgraduate. I lived in a Catholic world where, it was very easy to believe, well, we must be the norm. We must be the real. We must be, and I met a lot of nice Catholics in that world. Met some that weren't so nice too, but you could still maintain your illusion. Here's what I would say, without meaning disrespect toward anybody. The one true religion is whatever religion has helped you obey the two great commandments. Do you love the Lord your God with your whole heart, your whole soul, your whole mind, and your whole self? And do you love your neighbor as yourself? If you're doing that, you belong to the one true religion. Got it? You're authentically converted. And we just don't have time for other people saying they've got the one true religion, which is just a banner to wave. It has nothing to do with the authentic transformation we're talking about here. So, thirdly, and I've already dipped into this, but let me say a little more. And of course, this is in our very name, the Center for Action and Contemplation. You can have the experience of the absolute, the transformative moment that relativizes you and invites you into the world of love and grace. You can little by little allow your politics, your economics, your classism, your sexism, your homophobia to be changed. But these things really tend to not go very deep. They're just sort of badges of how enlightened you are, unless you find a way to go deep with all of the above. And that's what we mean by contemplation. So, unless you are led to some kind of practices that keep revealing to you your dualistic, argumentative, and angry way of thinking, that always wants to position yourself on the right side of everything, you won't move into a really new stage of life. You'll just have opinions. And maybe you'll have some good opinions, and we'll be happy you have those good opinions. But what we really need is a sustained practice that really rewires this. Now, that's what the practices of religion were meant to be. Something that rewired the way you read and access reality. As you've heard me quote probably many times over the years, one of our Franciscan philosophers and theologians was Saint Bonaventure. And he uses in his soul's journey to God a most wonderful Old Testament metaphor to describe the contemplative mind. I'm using it in my next book on the Trinity. I'm using it actually a little differently than he exactly presented it. But this is what he says. And I'm going to recall for you maybe what you once studied in the book of Exodus, where they're building the Ark of the Covenant. And it's described in great detail how it is to be built. And this is the sort of traveling portable temple. They're going to haul God around with them wherever they go, you know. And but it doesn't really hold God. It's the placeholder for God. In fact, what's described above it is even more beautiful. And it's called the throne of mercy. And it's described in great detail in, I think it's Exodus 24. It says there are to be 2 golden cherubs, and they are to be face to face, and they will protect the space. And then a few verses later, it says, in that space, I will meet you. In that space, I will meet you. So all the Ark of the Covenant is the placeholder. And I want to present that as the work of contemplation. Developing the inner witness that holds the place. Now let me describe it for you a little bit. Holds the place that opens to infinite horizon. The place that the golden cherubs protect is actually protecting infinite space. And that's the place where Yahweh says, I will meet you. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Protecting infinite space, protecting empty space. That's exactly what you have to do in the work of contemplation. But it is a work to guard that space. Now let me describe the problem. And we've come at this for 30 years here in many different ways, and I never say it exactly the same. But let me put it this way. Most of what you call thinking is narcissistic reaction to the moment, all right? Moment by moment, what you think about things, what you feel about things, whether things threaten you, whether things attract you. That really isn't thinking. It isn't. It's narcissistic reaction to the moment. What you got to get back to, and this is the placeholder, this is the Ark of the Covenant, you got to recognize that there's a part of you that is very quiet. It doesn't get caught up in all these commentaries, in all these emotional movements up and down, in and out, with and against. That part of you that sees you doing all of this, that's the only way I can describe it. It just stays still. And it lets it all float by, pass by. It learns from it all, but it doesn't attach to any of it. It lets go, it lets go, it lets go. It's the practicing of the Trinitarian letting go of all the things that we use to define ourselves. This takes years of practice to learn, so much so that letting go becomes an art form. That you really learn not to be opinionated, not to be emotionally drugged up and down, but to calmly stay in this quiet place that watches it all come and go. When you learn how to stay there, you'll recognize you are not your thinking. What you were thinking even an hour ago, you're not thinking anymore. It's not you. It's essentially unstable, right? And this is what almost all people think they are. They think they are their thinking. And that's why their whole life is so unstable. Why they have no ground on which to stand. So I want you to learn how to live in this open place where you stay still and you watch reality come and go. You learn from all of it. You let it change you, but you don't attach to it. You don't invest in it any more than God really tells you to. In other words, you got to detach before you know how to properly attach. That's contemplation. Then you know how to give yourself to things in themselves, as themselves, for themselves, apart from whether they're doing anything for you or whether they're attractive or unattractive. We had one of our students at the Living School last month. He takes people on walks and he teaches them while they walk. And he says he deliberately does not walk in beautiful places. He says that's what, holy people think. Oh, if the monastery was in a beautiful valley where birds were chirping and trees were all blooming, then I could be holy. Then I could love Jesus. That's, I've been there myself, believe me. That's the lie, though. And I think he was right on. No, when you can see the cracks in the broken sidewalks of downtown Albuquerque and let them delight you, and see the infinite in a grain of sand, as William Blake also says, then you're transformed, you see. You don't need reality to be pretty. You don't need it to be to your liking. You don't need to keep rearranging it and controlling it before you can be happy. You're happy already. So happiness is always an inside job. It's not what you see, it's not the object that creates your happiness. It's how you see it. And when the happiness question is already settled in here, when you're deeply contented and satisfied already, which I have to say is the heart of a God experience. Radical, radical satisfaction. Where you say, I don't need anything more than this. Some of us were even foolish enough to think we could be celibate and not have sex the rest of our life. We said, no, we don't need that. We had to struggle with it a little later. But in our moment of great emotional ecstasy, we were certain, that God would be enough. And God is enough. But you have to keep learning it and reappreciating this immense enoughness. So that's the third level of what we're trying to teach, what I'm trying to teach. First, conversion. Secondly, let's look for signs that you really have moved outside of yourself and beyond yourself. And thirdly, is there any kind of spiritual practice in your life that is going to deepen this process and sustain it over the long haul? So let me stop at that, and we can ask questions. I think I made most of the major points I wanted to make. I hope they weren't too scattered. But that gives us at least half an hour for questions. Okay, Carolyn will lead us. Carolyn is an Episcopal priest who is one of the 2 spiritual directors in our living school. And we're happy to have her here today.
Thank you also to those of you who have already sent in questions. And those of you in the studio, if you have questions you want to place in the basket, please feel free to do so. We have quite a number that have already come in from many places, and so we'll get started with this. An anonymous friend asks, how is the process of transforming society related to the process of individual transformation?
Oh, that's probably a good starter, isn't it? I hope I can get...
We have several here on politics.
Hope I can give some kind of answer. Well, obviously, what I would want to say and what you would want me to say is we better be asking both questions. Because I do think up to now, we've privatized and individualized salvation as something that was all about the individual going to heaven. Perhaps more than anything else, that has anesthetized and cheapened the gospel message of salvation. That God doesn't seem to care much about the corporate, about the whole, but just the individual. And, it's evident to me as a student of the Hebrew Scriptures that the great love affair that Israel enters into with Yahweh is all corporate, social, systemic. God is saving Israel. God is saving history. God's covenants are with society. And I don't think we later Western Christians recognize what a scandal it is, how we have narrowed and cheapened the gospel by making it into private individuals going to heaven, as if you could go without the rest of us, as if there could be a heaven unless we're all in it together. And so the individual transformed person would logically be seen as, I guess, the beginning place. That we got to start by changing your consciousness. But I hope the invitation, and that was my second step, is that this immediately invites you into the outer world, into the world that, first of all, doesn't look very religious and doesn't need to look religious. In fact, my friend Ron Rollheiser says that secularism is the inevitable child of the incarnation. Once you get the fact that God has taken on flesh, then you see the incarnate flesh everywhere. And the whole distinction between sacred and secular falls apart. So you will find yourself doing and attracted to maybe very, what we used to sadly call secular things, having jobs that don't look like they're churchy jobs at all. But again, it isn't what you do, it's how you do it. I'll take a lawyer, I'll take a construction worker, I'll take a nurse or a woman at the department store who's doing his or her work with love and with a smile and with joy in her heart any day over a grumpy priest at the altar, and we have a lot of them. And this isn't helping the cause. So we have to recognize that the link is essential between individual conversion and transformation of history. Now, I don't know what God's intention is. Is the second coming of Christ going to be when everybody gets it? I doubt it, But is it going to be when there's been a bride prepared to make love to the bridegroom? That there's what we would call today, a sufficient number for humanity to say, "Come, Lord Jesus," to enter into the love affair. That would be my expectation. But our job in the meantime is still to use our individual enlightenment for corporate transformation. Now, the scientific evidence is not good that institutions and corporations can operate at a high level. We're told that institutions, by necessity, have to be self-centered. They have to be concerned about self-maintenance, self-protection, raising money, providing for themselves. So I'm not sure that everything we're capable of as individuals can always be asked of an organization, a nation, or an institution. But we can still keep talking about it. We can still keep inviting people forward. We can still keep writing documents that enlighten the world. And then I guess I'm saying we have to let go of the consequences. And what God does from there is God's business. I hope that's some kind of satisfying answer.
Thank you. My ordaining bishop used to have a bumper sticker that said, "There is no secular world." Yeah. While we're in the political arena here, our listener, Lynn, would like to know, how do we participate in the political processes in the USA with a transformed perspective given the current state of the presidential campaign? You know this had to come.
Yeah. First of all, maybe I'm just protecting myself, but there's no one-size-fits-all answer that you should do this. And I'm certainly not going to give it because I don't know what it is. But I would just think that you will approach the whole thing humbly and gingerly, not wrapped too tightly around any one candidate being the savior of the world. We're dealing with a fallen system. We're dealing with a system that's inherently dualistic. So Bonaventure says those two golden cherubs are to protect the third something, you see. We could see them almost as the left and the right. And he says they got to keep gazing at one another. And they hold the third space. Isn't that brilliant? And in the third space, the third something arises. Now, is that independence, the third party, so-called? I don't know. But I'm certainly not telling you not to vote. But I hope you don't vote with over-expectation that any candidate can bring about the reign of God, right? That any candidate can stand for all of our gospel issues. And I think one of the great weaknesses of Catholic politics for the last 20 years has been this horrible thing called one-issue voting. That because one party would stand for one issue they agreed with, they'd throw in their lot and think that was voting for the gospel. Both sides are compromised, huh? And so you have to get off your pedestal of superiority, your pedestal of purity or moral righteousness, and enter into this tainted, dusty world and say, okay, what do they say? Politics is the art of the possible. So I certainly wouldn't tell you not to be invested. Work for your little bit of good in your city for the values that you believe in. And then on election day, pray and do what you must do. And I have to admit, in some cases, that might lead some of you to say, I can't vote. And that might be okay too. Voting isn't one of the 10 commandments, really. It's something I would hope you could invest yourself in, but you can probably do God's work without voting in the American political system. I hope that helps.
Thank you. How do we know when to embrace what is challenging and difficult without letting ourselves be wounded by what is toxic? How do we embrace what is difficult, really be open to that whole contemplative invitation without letting ourselves be torn away and wounded?
You cannot do it. Here's why. I know I sound like, always giving the same answer, contemplation, but unless you have non-dual consciousness, you don't know how to do that. You always choose sides. But to hold the two sides, the two golden cherubs, right? To hold both sides, what's difficult and what's attractive, and to learn to live inside of paradox, to live inside of that open space, that third something where I'm not sure I'm right. And even more wonderfully, where I don't need to prove I'm right. What a freedom, huh? To not need to prove that you're right. I had a very humble father. He was a German farmer in Kansas and only educated in the 4th grade. And I remember the few times I was with him that he would dare to raise a question to the checkout person or the person who was working with him. And he'd always precede it by this most lovely phrase. So parents know that what you say, your kids are listening. He'd say, I'm sure you're a better man than I, but you charge me too much, or whatever. It was always the same phrase. I'm sure you're a better man than I. That's the freedom not to need to think or know you're right. I don't have to know I'm right. We're all operating tentatively, which is humbly, I think. Huh? Only God is good. Only God is right. Only God is true. In Franciscan philosophy, love was a higher virtue than truth. And in fact, we were taught that if it isn't loving, it isn't the truth. If it isn't loving, it isn't the truth. We disagreed with the Dominicans there, right? Those Dominicans, they put truth higher. We had big debates about this. We said, no, if it isn't, and they were making another legitimate point. I'm not trying to be dualistic and say we were right and they were wrong, but I think it's one of the most precious jewels of my own tradition is that love is the primacy. Love is the supreme value. So love can do that. Love can do that. Unlove can't do that.
Our listener, Jean, would like to know, is it inherently bad to have wealth?
Well, it can't be inherently bad. No. It's dangerous. That's what certainly Jesus says very clearly. It's dangerous. And you better know what you're doing, and you better be enlightened to know how to handle that much power, especially in our world where that's almost the only criteria of importance. It gives you a kind of status that you really don't deserve. Do we need to describe people who are in the political process now, who we all know have gotten power because of money and for no other reason, no other qualification? It's sort of unbelievable. That could only happen in a country that worships money. And so you see the danger of it, that all the other criteria of wisdom and love and truth-speaking are no longer even values. This is scary. So we're seeing right now how dangerous it is. And if the other candidate on the other side is speaking any truth, which I think he is, saying that the 1% are controlling the 99% of this country, then certainly we're seeing the great danger of money, because it gives you a power to manipulate and control and feel superior, which quite frankly you have not earned, and you really do not deserve. So I think those of us who are in any way comfortable, and I'm comfortable too, by the way, we just have to make sure that we do that second step, and that we keep moving out of our world of superiority into a world where we know that we put on our clothes like everybody else, that we're naked underneath our clothes like everybody else. And without that, I would surely agree with Jesus' metaphor of the camel and the eye of the needle. It's done with great difficulty. You usually carry with it a sense of entitlement. But I know very wealthy people. I'm friends with some very wealthy people who are wholeheartedly generous and given. I do. And I know very poor people who are total materialists, total, and total militarists, who have angry, hateful hearts, who hate everybody in sight, and they're poor. So that's why, again, the external behavior is not the final criteria. You've got to always go inside and say, what are you doing with it, and where are you going with it? But thank you for having the courage to ask the question.
Thank you. David would like to ask a question about just business. And the question is, how do we justly engage in business that builds, produces, and creates, while at the same time moving to the edges and downwards?
Well, you certainly don't want to say that there's anything wrong with effectiveness, productivity. My gosh, what good that has done for the world. And we have to even say, statistically, capitalism, which still has to be critiqued, but has lessened the percentage of poor people on this earth like no other system in this world. That's literally, I think that's true. I think that's true. So do you see how can we affirm it and recognize that productivity is good? But here's our problem today. That if Descartes in the 18th century said, I think, therefore I am, what you and I are trained to say is, I produce, therefore I am. And I consume, therefore I am. That has become the American and the Western European identity that we've spread to all the world. That our very identity comes from our production and, ironically, our consumption. That to be able to consume a lot is strangely considered virtuous. Only in a capitalist world would that be thought of. That was a capital sin in all of previous history. It was called gluttony and greed. But those are no longer capital sins. Do you know that? In our world. We've rewritten the book. We've rewritten the book of what capital sins are. And we've said gluttony is not a capital sin and greed is not a capital sin. In fact, it's a virtue. So that's why I'm glad you asked the question. Because unless you bring that critical mind to the world, and I mean critical in a positive sense, to the world of production and consumption, you'll almost always get snagged by it. You'll sell your soul to the company store. You think it's the only game in town. I produce, I consume, therefore I am an upstanding American citizen. That's really sick. Because of the Movies and Meaning film festival we're going to have here next month, I'm being forced to watch some movies that I probably wouldn't watch otherwise, but I got to say something intelligent about them. And I just watched one this afternoon. Correct me if Koanakwatsi? Yeah. Wow. It's an hour and a half movie, completely only music in the background and scenes that start with nature, and then in the hour and a half move you out of nature into a world that's ever more frenetic, ever more angry, dark, unhappy. Won't tell you how it all comes to a conclusion. But it appears to be making that point. What have we sacrificed? What have we sold for this world of productivity? It doesn't say it's wrong, but it shouts at you, you better watch out. The word is a Hopi word from our brothers and sisters in this part of the world, meaning life out of balance. Life out of balance. And I think that was a good choice of a title, because it does reveal not that we're inherently evil or wrong, but very imbalanced. And interestingly enough, that's precisely the way most native religions describe virtue, balance, harmony. Not too much of anything, not too little of anything. We call it the virtue of temperance. But I don't know that that's even a virtue anymore. Most people don't know what that means. Temperance. To know when to say no to yourself, to know when to say that's enough. Who are the people who can do that? People who have experienced the enough. When you know that you are enough, when you live in the world of abundance, you don't need to keep accumulating and hoarding or producing to prove yourself. It's very hard for us, especially the male of the species, who so defines himself in the external world of production and performance. It's very hard for him to let go of. And unfortunately, the younger women tend to be buying the same model. I don't think my mother's generation had that so much. Not at all. But that's changing. So now we're both, in my opinion, we're both in the same trap. What else?
Well, we have a couple questions in the pastoral care department. One is from Donna, who asks, she says, I've had people laugh when I've said my divorce has been a conversion experience, but it has been. Can you talk more about how suffering and letting go can be transformative?
Okay. See, conversion is all about giving up control. So something has to come into your life that forces you, I'm sorry to have to put it that way, but the ego just isn't going to give up control till it has to. It isn't. You're not, and I'm not. For most of us, it has to be forced upon us. It has to be taken from us. And then in that process, we little by little learn to say, okay, God's in this. I'm okay. In fact, as this woman has the courage to say, even though I appear to have maybe broken the rules or done it wrong, I think I've done it right. That's the kind of wisdom you come to, and why Paul is so hard on the law. Because the law, once you get on that other side, the law can't answer all your questions. You don't have the safety net of knowing you're right. You know what? That's what it means to live in faith. Right? Finally, you live in faith, trusting in the goodness of God, not earning it because you've been obedient to the law. So isn't this the irony of ironies? That many people, like people in a second marriage, and I know a lot, who are so much more alive and human in their second marriage than they were in their first. I'm not encouraging it. I wish it didn't have to happen. But for an awful lot of people, their first marriage was sort of their starter kit. I mean, it's where they learn to grow up. It's where they learn to apologize and forgive and admit they're wrong. And it was their school. It was their school. So that, to me, is not surprising at all. It's almost the norm. In the same way for those of us in the priesthood and religious life, so many of the best priests I know considered leaving very seriously. They realized this was not working for them until they learned how to make it work or let God make it work. It's that kind of falling upward, which, as you know, I love to talk about, that defines the gospel journey. And that's why Pope Francis is telling us in so many ways, not to make these crass, quick judgments about who's in and who's out, who's right and who's wrong. The law allows you to do that. Once you swim in the ocean of grace, that luxury is taken away from you. You do not know. You do not know the heart. You do not know the chemistry of God's grace in a person's life. And if there's 6 billion people, there's 6 billion journeys on this earth. That's what John of the Cross said. That's what Teresa of Avila said. We've got to honor the individual soul. And this day of one size fits all, just declare the truth from the Sunday pulpit, and this is going to answer the questions of the soul. I don't think so. And you as a spiritual director, of course, know that better than most. Let me, again, I don't mean to be unkind, but when you meet real people, I get a lot of mail. I mean, just this week, the stories I get in mail, just the amount of people who have left the church because of being cruelly treated, being forced to obey the law and being shamed because they didn't. I mean, I think there's more of those than in the church sometimes, because a lot of in the church are still dragging their tails because of those shaming and humiliating experiences. We can't keep doing that to people. And that's why we thank God that Pope Francis has declared this to be the year of mercy. And isn't it wonderful that open space, to get back to the Ark of the Covenant, was called the throne of mercy, or the mercy seat, it might be translated in your Bible. The open space held by the two is the throne of mercy. Wow, it's all there. You just got to keep looking.
I'm going to take a question out of order because I think it will be a good segue question between what you're saying right now and several questions that we have on spiritual practice. And that question is, how do you know, or how does the transformation journey help us to know when to hang in with what is difficult and when to shake the dust off our feet and move on?
Well, I think the only honest answer I can give is when you know you can't do it, when you can come before the Lord and say, Lord, I don't have the strength for this. Now, first you have ask the Lord, ask God to give you the grace, the strength to endure. But when you find it's making you a bitter old man or a bitter old woman, and I do not have the strength, Therese, the little flower, would just go in her bedroom, which I got to see last year, and just beat on the pillow that I don't know how to love these damn nuns. They're driving me crazy. And if you've ever read her autobiography, I mean, it was a house of some unhealthy women, She didn't live with a bunch of saints. She had to learn to love some very unlovable women. I think she learned some of her spirituality by recognizing when she couldn't do it. And the naming of that inability was, in fact, her little way. I don't know how to love her. You understand? I don't know how to love today. I don't know how to go to the recreation room and talk graciously to the nuns right now. But it's my problem. It's not theirs. And that was her genius. That she didn't scapegoat, the other nuns are all terrible and I'm wonderful. Her thing was always, I don't know how to love. I don't know how to love. And she made a science of love out of that. So these situations that don't work, I've coined a new word, just been using it for a month now or so. They become negative capability. I love this phrase, right? Probably overusing it now, but negative capability is by not doing it right, by experience of the absence, by failure, that actually creates the longing, the need, the desire, and the hope to do it right. Do you see? And that's, I call it in my, when I try to teach people how to read Scripture, the 2 steps backward quotes. And I would say, easily half of the Bible is 2 steps backward quotes. I hope you know that. It isn't all, it's filled with vengeance and anger and polygamy and genocide and rape and adultery, and it's always getting it wrong, missing the point. And yet the text stays with grace and keeps out of that negative capability, which I picture now like a rubber band pulled backward. It shoots you forward. So if you can use the situations that you cannot succeed at to be negative capability to either go elsewhere, right, to take a respite from this place where you cannot love, where people are making you bitter or angry or whatever, use the pullback not to shame yourself or hate yourself or even call it failure, but call it grace. Call it grace. And I'm glad you used that quote. Did she use that, the shake the dust from your feet?
No, that was mine.
That was you, yeah. I think that's, what else could Jesus have meant by that marvelous, liberating quote? There are times after you know you've tried, after you know you've done your best, after you've asked for grace, and God leaves you there in your inability to shake the dust from your feet and say, I cannot do it. And I must go elsewhere where I can experience whatever it is you need to experience. Yeah.
Which is a very freeing experience when you
yeah.
finally come to that place.
Sure.
Richard, we have about 4 questions about spiritual practice and several about connection here. So,
Right.
and
We'll do the best we can.
and a clarification about the third way.
All right.
So, do you have an opinion about which way you want to go?
Well, just dive in.
Just dive in. All right.
Whatever.
So, briefly, what do you mean by the third way or the third something?
All right. Well, first of all, let me get myself off the hook. Cynthia Bourgeau, who teaches here in our living school, talks on this much better. Her book on the Trinity, and we're going to put out one of our editions of Wanting next year on this whole theme called the Principle of Three. Is that what we're going to call it? Yeah. The Law of Three. The Law of Three. This has taken many different forms. I gave you one on the 2 cherubs protecting the third space. It took philosophical form in Gurdjieff and Hegel, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So it isn't unique to me. It's actually the principle of the Trinity. So Trinity, I always say, our very shape of God, as we as Christians understand God, undoes dualistic thinking. And the principle of 3 is inherently dynamic. 2 is always argumentative. That's why I can't get excited about our 2 political parties. It's inherently violent. It's inherently makes you proud and say half-truths to win your case, because that's the all-important thing. When you move into 3, you move into a spiral, a circle, a movement, a dynamism. It's inherently mobile, like the Ark of the Covenant was. It takes you to new places. So you don't settle for dualistic thinking that one side is ever 100% right. Now, I'm sure you're using this book too much today, but I know I have a chapter in here saying what dualistic thinking is not. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, here it is. And this applies to what you're asking here. Non-dual thinking is not relativism. It's not skepticism. It's not merely saying, well, there's 2 sides to everything. It's not merely admitting that there are different perspectives in any situation, which there are, of course. It's not fuzzy thinking. It's not a refusal to place your bet. It's not esoteric Eastern philosophy. It's not postmodern nihilism. It's not an avoidance of appropriate judgments. Those are all the criticisms that have been thrown at me when I try to teach non-dual thinking. They think that that's what I'm saying. So that's not what I'm saying. In fact, and I'm so glad I used the Ark of the Covenant metaphor that Bonaventure gave me. It's opening to a truth that neither side can come to alone and apart. It's waiting for the paradox of everything to reveal itself. It's quite frankly being patient before mystery. It's being humble about your knowing. It's once we know that God is mystery, that the throne of mercy is an infinite horizon to open space, then we're not afraid of non-dual thinking or the third way. So the third way is simply the result of non-dual thinking. Got it? That you will come up and you'll find yourself much more imaginative, to be perfectly honest, than arguing for the Democrats or the Republicans. Do you understand? You'll find it hard, even though you'll say, well, I have to agree with him on that point. I have to grant him that. Even the one you dislike the most, whoever that might be, or she might be, always you can grant them the truth that is there. That keeps your heart space open. Because once the heart space closes down, there's no dialogue or communion possible. So wait for our next year's edition of Wanting, where we're going to give a whole edition to what do we mean by the law of three. Cynthia calls it third force thinking. And she says there's holy affirming, there's holy denying, and even the holy denying can become a new holy affirming, and the spiral just keeps moving. It's not the taking of a side, but it's always a dynamic moving to a new way of seeing things. I would be willing to bet that a lot of you are already there in some ways. You really are. You don't know it. You don't have to call it third way thinking or third force thinking. If you're compassionate and humble in the way you deal with relationships, you're there. You are. You're already there. You're already saying, okay, I mean, how do you survive in a marriage? You married people. I mean, it seems to me marriage is made to order to teach you third force thinking. Because you can't agree with everything your partner says or does. I hope not. But there's a bigger field of love, of caring, of patience, of acceptance that allows you to say, I want relationship more than I want to be right. And that's what God is saying. Every time God forgives you, I want a relationship with you more than I want to be right. That's third way thinking. The whole mystery of forgiveness proceeds from third force thinking. Yeah. Okay.
We are about at the end here. I'm going to end with just a simple little question, probably 25 words or less.
Sound devious. Go ahead.
Howard wants to know, many Christians use John 3:16 as the membership card into heaven. Can you give us the transformed explanation?
What's John 3:16?
For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son.
And they use that to...
as the membership, that if you can say that, you are de facto a Christian.
Oh, okay. I thought, see, the one they usually use, that's why I was confused, is John 14:6. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That quote doesn't seem to prove the point, but that's no bother.
This is the one that appears on keychains and lunchboxes.
Oh, yeah, John 3:16.
What's the transformed understanding of that?
All right. Now I got to give you a whole scripture course in 1 minute. All right. In John's gospel, we have the cosmic Christ walking around talking, all right? This is 70 years since Jesus is gone. Christology is highly evolved and developed. This is no longer the Jesus of Nazareth of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's pretty obvious. This is a completely different figure in John's gospel. So he's talking about eternal truth and eternal mystery. He's not, well, let me, before I say that, he's first of all talking to in-house language. You can talk to your inner group in ways that, like when I say, I'm the greatest candidate that the Republican Party has ever produced. We all know that isn't true, but we know he's got to talk that way to Republicans. Do you understand? Well, the Christ is talking that way to the Christian community. It's our language. But the wonderful thing is this Christ mystery is now beyond tribalism. It's beyond tribal religion. And we're still having Jesus walking around saying these things. That's the exegetical problem with a quote like that. That it's trying to make it an advertisement for the Jesus religion, all right? And I hope you belong to the Jesus religion. But there's a lot of people who belong to the Jesus religion, let me put it this way, who love Jesus, but who don't love the eternal Christ, right? Which is to love everything. Christ is a stand-in for everything. Paul says that in Colossians and in Corinthians. He is in everything. He is everything. The Christ mystery is the eternal mystery of truth that existed since the beginning of time. And people can love the Christ mystery without using that name and without belonging to the Jesus religion. And if you think I'm a heretic, let me end by quoting a doctor of the church and a saint. We have Norbertines here who follow his rule. Augustine said, right, there are many that the church has that God does not have. And there's many that God has that the church does not have. There it is. Don't make the Christian mystery simultaneous or coterminous with those who belong to the Christian religion. We wish they were always the same. I'm afraid they're not. I hope that doesn't leave you squirming in your seat there in Taiwan or wherever you are, but I hope it's somehow helpful. Thank you, and forgive me for all the things I surely said poorly. Thank you. Good.
Thank you, Richard. And
welcome.
our thanks to all of you who sent questions, and our apologies for not being able to get to them all. But I hope that the forming of the question was itself a kind of answer. And with that, we conclude this webcast. Thank you very much. Good night.